When I first moved into the old apartment building, I thought it would be just another anonymous place to pass through. Four walls, a quiet hallway, maybe the occasional polite nod to neighbors. The building itself had a kind of faded charm. Wooden floors that creaked under the slightest step, brass doorknobs worn smooth from decades of use, and a lingering scent of coffee and detergent that clung to the hallways. But the real heart of the place revealed itself in the four women who lived just down the corridor from me. They weren't like anyone I'd met before. Each one carried herself with a presence that was impossible to ignore. The first was warm and motherly, though not in a way that made her seem old, more in the way she always had a soft smile ready, a tone of voice that made you want to listen. The second had wit sharp enough to slice through the dullest day. Her comments always made the others laugh, and even in passing she seemed to look at me with a glint of curiosity. The third was elegance personified. Quiet, poised, always dressed with an understated grace that made her presence feel almost magnetic. And then there was the fourth. Playful, with a sly smile and eyes that lingered just a fraction longer than they needed to, as though she was always watching for a reaction. At first, my encounters with them were fleeting. A quick good morning when we crossed paths in the stairwell, or a nod when I was juggling grocery bags and one of them stepped aside to let me through. But even in those small exchanges, something stirred. I remember the way one of them brushed past me, the faintest trace of her perfume trailing in the air long after she was gone. Or the time I caught a bit of laughter spilling out of their apartment, warm and overlapping, like four instruments playing in perfect harmony. It didn't feel like the usual noise of neighbors. It felt like being invited into a rhythm I didn't yet understand. There were moments I caught them looking at me differently than strangers usually do. Not with the blank courtesy of city life, but with something more alive. One leaned slightly closer than necessary when she asked me if I had settled in yet. Another rested her hand on my arm, light as air, when she thanked me for holding the door. Their gestures seemed casual, but the way they lingered in my memory told me they weren't. I couldn't help but notice the contrast, me, 24 and still trying to figure out who I was, and them, women who seemed to already know. Women who had lived enough to carry both confidence and a quiet kind of vulnerability in their eyes. I didn't know then what their presence would mean for me, but as I closed my door that first week, I found myself listening for the sound of their footsteps in the hall, or the faint clink of glasses from behind their door. Already, without realizing it, I was drawn into their orbit. It started with little gestures. A knock on my door one evening, the elegant one asking if I had a spare screwdriver because her lamp wouldn't stop flickering. I didn't even think twice. I grabbed my toolkit and followed her inside. Her apartment was bathed in warm amber light, a subtle contrast to the sterile brightness of mine. The scent of lavender drifted from somewhere, maybe a candle hidden on a shelf, and I realized how carefully curated her world was compared to my own. She hovered close as I knelt by the lamp, her voice low as she asked questions, though none of them really had to do with what I was fixing. When the light finally steadied, she smiled in a way that seemed to last longer than the moment itself. Another night, I was headed up the stairwell when the playful one stopped me mid-step, balancing two grocery bags that were clearly too heavy for her. "If you're going this way anyway," she teased, her tone light but her eyes serious. I carried the bags into her kitchen, and before I knew it, I was seated at her counter with a glass of iced tea in my hand. She moved easily around the kitchen, brushing past me more than once in the narrow space, her shoulder grazing mine, her laughter spilling like sunlight into the small room. When I left, she touched my wrist, just briefly, and said, "You should stop by more often." It was never formal, never a direct invitation, but somehow I began to find myself included. The witty one waved me over one afternoon when I passed their door left open, pulling me into a circle of conversation about movies, about neighbors, about things I didn't know but quickly learned. They spoke over each other, laughed at inside jokes, yet somehow always folded me in, as though I had been part of their rhythm all along. The nurturing one made sure I had a cup of tea in hand before I even sat down. And though I laughed with them, I couldn't shake the feeling of something unsaid hanging in the air, like a line of music always on the edge of resolving. I noticed the details more than I should have. How the warmth of their hands lingered a moment after passing me something. How their eyes would meet mine just a second too long before sliding away. The sound of their voices, overlapping and distinct, became something I listened for through the walls at night. It wasn't just about neighbors anymore. These were invitations, silent, subtle, but undeniable. And every time I stepped back into my own empty apartment, I felt the difference. Their spaces were alive with warmth and presence. Mine felt like a waiting room. I couldn't name it yet, but I knew something was changing. The four women weren't just letting me in out of courtesy. They were pulling me closer, slowly, with gestures that felt like nothing, and yet, everything. It was a Saturday evening when everything shifted. I had just come back from running errands, arms full of groceries, when I found two of the women struggling with boxes at the bottom of the stairwell. Without thinking, I set my own bags aside and carried the heavier ones up for them. By the time we reached the landing, all four were there, waiting at their open door, laughing at how I'd been roped in. Before I could excuse myself, they insisted I come inside for a drink as thanks. Their apartment felt different that night. Usually, it was filled with quick laughter and playful energy, but this time it carried a quieter weight. The lights were dimmed, soft music playing in the background. A half-empty bottle of wine sat on the table, and I could tell they'd been talking long before I arrived. At first, the conversation was casual, the usual small talk about neighbors, work, the stubborn elevator that rattled more than it should. But then, almost without warning, the playful one let out a sigh. "You know," she said, staring into her glass, "sometimes I hate how invisible I feel now, like the world just looks past me." The room fell silent. I saw the others glance at her, not with surprise, but with recognition, as though she'd given voice to something they'd all been holding back. The witty one spoke next, softer than I'd ever heard her. "I feel it too. I go out, I sit in a cafe, and no one looks twice. I used to complain about too much attention, and now," she trailed off, shaking her head with a bitter smile. The elegant one nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "It's not just about attention. It's about connection. Having someone who sees you, really sees you." I sat there, listening, my chest tight. I hadn't expected this. These women who carried themselves with such confidence, who filled every room with presence. They were admitting to something fragile, something raw. The nurturing one, usually so steady, reached for my hand without seeming to notice she'd done it. "It gets heavy sometimes," she whispered. "The quiet, the being alone." Her touch was light, but it grounded the room. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure them, to tell them they weren't invisible. Not to me, not to anyone paying real attention. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just sat there, letting the weight of their honesty settle over me. The rain had begun outside, soft at first, then harder, tapping against the window. The sound seemed to underline everything, that sense of being small in a vast, indifferent world. But inside, something else was happening. A shift. They had let me see behind the curtain of strength and composure, revealing their vulnerability not as weakness, but as truth. And I felt something stir in me. A pull to protect, to stay, to matter to them the way they clearly longed to matter to someone. That night, I realized I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. They were letting me into the spaces they usually kept hidden. And once you've seen someone like that, truly seen them, you can't go back to pretending they're just another face in the hallway. The storm came suddenly that evening. One moment the air was heavy with heat. The next the sky had split open with thunder. I had just settled into my apartment when the power cut out, leaving me in silence so thick it pressed against the walls. The building groaned under the weight of wind and rain, and for a moment I considered just riding it out in the dark. But then came the knock. Sharp at first, then lighter, almost teasing. When I opened my door, all four of them were there. Candlelight flickered in their hands, throwing soft halos around their faces. The nurturing one spoke first, her voice warm but firm. "Don't stay alone tonight. Come with us." Before I could even reply, the witty one added with a grin, "Besides, our wine won't finish itself." I tried to laugh it off, to say I'd be fine, but they didn't move. The playful one leaned closer, her eyes catching the candlelight. "Tonight," she whispered, almost conspiratorial, "you're not going anywhere." Something in the way she said it made my chest tighten. Not a command, but a promise. Before I knew it, I was following them down the hallway into their apartment, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt final. Inside, the world transformed. Dozens of candles lit the room, their flames dancing shadows across the walls. The storm outside howled against the windows, but here, the air was thick with warmth and closeness. The elegant one guided me toward the couch, her shawl brushing against my arm as she passed. I sat, feeling suddenly surrounded, not by threat but by presence. Four sets of eyes, four kinds of energy, all directed at me. They moved easily around me, pouring wine, adjusting candles, settling in close. The witty one dropped into the seat beside me, her leg brushing mine as she leaned in to tell a joke, her laughter vibrating through the cushion we shared. The playful one perched on the armrest, her fingers trailing lightly along the back of my neck as she teased me for how tense I looked. Across from me, the elegant one crossed her legs gracefully, her gaze steady and unreadable. The nurturing one sat nearest, her hand resting on my forearm as though to reassure me that I belonged there. The room pulsed with something I couldn't name. Not just comfort, not just friendship, but a charge that hummed beneath every glance, every brush of skin. The storm outside raged louder, rattling the windows, but here, I felt anchored. Their laughter filled the spaces between thunderclaps, their closeness drowning out the fear of the dark. At one point, I realized they had closed in around me completely. Not in a way that trapped me, but in a way that wrapped me. Four presences leaning closer, their voices overlapping, their warmth folding me into a circle I hadn't known I needed. And though a part of me wanted to resist, to remind myself of the age difference, of how unusual this all was, another part of me felt an undeniable truth. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. The storm outside refused to let up. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled like a warning. Yet inside their candlelit apartment, the atmosphere had shifted into something slower, heavier, and far more difficult to ignore. We sat together, sharing wine and stories. At first, the conversation carried its usual rhythm. Light teasing from the witty one, playful interruptions from the mischievous one, thoughtful remarks from the elegant one, gentle reassurances from the nurturing one. But as the night wore on, their laughter softened, replaced by long pauses that carried weight. In those silences, I felt their eyes on me, each gaze different, yet all carrying a quiet pull I didn't know how to name. The closeness happened gradually. The witty one leaned into me as she laughed, her shoulder pressing warmly against mine, and she didn't pull back even when the laughter faded. The nurturing one shifted closer, placing a cushion behind my back, her hand lingering just a second too long on my shoulder as she adjusted it. The playful one brushed past me to reach for a bottle on the table, her fingertips grazing my knee as though by accident, but the sly curve of her smile told me it wasn't. The elegant one sat across from me, but her gaze rarely wavered, her eyes catching mine in the glow of candlelight until I had to look away. I tried to focus on their words, but it was the spaces between them that left me restless. The brush of a hand, the heat of a shoulder pressed against mine, the way their laughter seemed to vibrate through me. My own apartment, dark and silent, felt like another world entirely. Here, I was suspended in a bubble of warmth and closeness, where time bent and stretched with every glance. At one point, the witty one leaned across me to reach the wine. Her hair brushed against my cheek, soft and cool, and I caught a hint of citrus in her perfume. My pulse quickened at the simple intimacy of it. She poured, then passed me the glass, her fingers grazing mine deliberately, her smile faint but knowing. The playful one joined me on the couch arm again, leaning down until her cheek almost brushed my hair. She whispered something teasing about how outnumbered I was, but her tone was low, intimate, meant only for me. The warmth of her breath against my ear sent a shiver racing down my spine. And still, part of me resisted. I was 24, sitting in the company of 4 women who had lived far more than I had. Women who seemed to know exactly what they were doing while I stumbled in uncertainty. Was I imagining the undercurrent? Was it loneliness speaking, or something real sparking between us? The nurturing one seemed to sense the tension building in me. She reached across, resting her hand lightly on my knee. Not insistent, not demanding, but grounding. "Relax," she murmured, her eyes soft. "You're safe here." In that moment, as thunder cracked outside and candlelight flickered shadows across their faces, I realized safety had never felt so electric. The storm had deepened into the kind of night that erases the outside world. The rain no longer tapped. It pounded, and the thunder rolled without pause, a low growl in the distance. Yet inside their apartment, the noise felt muffled, almost irrelevant. The only thing that seemed to exist was the glow of the candles and the 4 women gathered close around me. Our laughter had long since faded, replaced by softer voices, almost whispers, as though the storm demanded reverence. We spoke of small things at first, old movies, half-forgotten songs, the stubborn building with its unreliable elevator. But slowly, the conversation turned inward again, pulled toward something more vulnerable, more dangerous. It was the elegant one who broke the silence. She set her glass down with care, her long fingers trembling slightly in the candlelight. "You know," she began, her voice steady but low, "people think age makes you unshakable, that you stop craving closeness, that you stop feeling the ache. But it doesn't. If anything, it only sharpens it." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The witty one leaned forward, her usual spark dimmed into something more fragile. "I thought I'd be fine. Independent, self-assured, all those things people say. But some nights I sit here, glass of wine in hand, and wonder if anyone will ever look at me the way I used to be looked at." Her eyes flicked toward me, and for the first time, I saw not just playfulness in her gaze, but longing. The nurturing one's hand found mine on the couch. Her touch was soft, steady. "Connection matters more than age," she whispered. "Sometimes people come into your life and they see you, really see you. And that's worth more than all the years and all the expectations." The playful one, usually full of teasing remarks, grew uncharacteristically quiet. She sat perched near me, her hand lightly resting on my shoulder. "We're not blind," she said softly, almost reluctantly. "We know how this looks, but what we feel, it's real. And tonight, with you here, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels alive." My heart hammered in my chest. Their words, their closeness, the way their hands seemed to find me, on my wrist, my arm, my shoulder. It all fused into something overwhelming. Not demand, not pressure, but an honesty that stripped away every polite mask. They weren't asking for promises or declarations. They were admitting something raw, that they wanted to be seen, held, valued, not in spite of their age, but simply as they were. I swallowed hard, unable to form a reply. Inside me, a battle raged, part fear, part desire, part awe. I was younger, yes, but in this moment that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the way their presence wrapped around me, grounding me against the storm outside. The elegant one's gaze caught mine again, steady and unflinching. "Age is just a number," she said quietly. "What matters is what we choose, and who we choose." And though I couldn't yet say the words out loud, something in me knew the truth. I wanted to choose them too. At some point, the night blurred into stillness. The storm outside finally eased, the thunder rolling off into the distance, the rain softening into a steady hush against the windows. Candles burned low, their wax pooling onto saucers, the room heavy with the scent of smoke and melted wax. I must have drifted off without realizing it, because when I opened my eyes again, morning light was spilling gently through the curtains. What struck me first was not the sunlight, but the warmth pressed close around me. The witty one was slumped against my shoulder, her head resting lightly, strands of her hair tickling my neck. The playful one had curled herself on the rug nearby, her hand still resting on my knee as though she'd fallen asleep mid-conversation. The elegant one was stretched out on the opposite couch. Her shawl slipped to the floor, her expression softened in sleep. And the nurturing one. She was closest, her cheek against my arm, her hand loosely entwined with mine, her breathing steady and calm. For a moment I didn't move. I just sat there, letting the weight of the scene wash over me. The night before felt almost like a dream. Confessions spoken in candlelight, touches that lingered, truths admitted without fear. But this was no dream. This was morning, clear and unguarded. And they were here, surrounding me in quiet trust. The playful one stirred first, blinking awake. She caught me looking down at her, and instead of teasing, she just gave me a sleepy smile. "Guess we kidnapped you after all," she murmured, her voice husky from sleep, that woke the others slowly, one by one. There was no awkward scramble, no rush to explain. Only small stretches, soft laughter at stiff shoulders, and the quiet acknowledgement that none of us had wanted the night to end. The nurturing one rose first, slipping into the kitchen. Soon, the smell of coffee filled the air, joined by the gentle crackle of bread toasting. The elegant one gathered cushions, smoothing them back into place, while the witty one teased her about being too tidy so early in the day. The playful one tugged me toward the table, insisting I sit as though I belonged there, because somehow I already did. We ate together in that sunlit room, not as neighbors bound by walls, but as something else, something unspoken yet understood. There were no heavy words, no attempts to define what the night had meant. Instead, there were glances that lingered longer than necessary, hands brushing when plates were passed, the warmth of shared silence that needed no explanation. As I lifted the cup of coffee to my lips, I felt the nurturing one's hand brush mine. The elegant one caught my gaze across the table and held it, steady, unhurried. The witty one laughed at something small, but her eyes softened when they met mine. And the playful one leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "See? You were never meant to go anywhere." In that moment I understood. Whatever this was, whatever shape it might take, it was rare and real. And though undefined, it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't walk away from. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't simply living beside people. I was part of them, and it felt like home.